40,000 people walked through one gate in a single afternoon. Nearly all of them pushed toward the same building. Inside, behind iron bars sharing the enclosure with an orangutan and a parrot, sat a man. A sign gave his age, his height, his weight, and the river in the Congo he had been brought from. This was the Bronx Zoo, New York, September of 1906. The man's name was Ota Benga, and on the day 40,000 people came through the gate to see him, he was, by a wide margin, the most profitable attraction in the park. Most of the trades this kind of channel prices out left almost nothing behind. Ships rot. Ledgers burn. Human zoos are the rare exception. This business kept its receipts. Newspapers counted the crowds by the thousand. Fair boards published their budgets. When a manager stole from the very people he managed, a court wrote down the exact figure. We are not reconstructing this industry from fragments. We are reading the invoice. Start with the man who built the category, because his own numbers give you the whole shape of the business. Carl Hagenbeck ran an animal import firm out of Hamburg, the kind of operation that supplied seals, big cats, and elephants to zoos and circuses across Europe. By the mid-1870s, the exotic animal market was flooded, margins were thin, and Hagenbeck needed a new product. In 1874, he found one. 6 Sami herders from Norway, brought over with about 30 reindeer, set up in a public square in Hamburg to carry on their ordinary lives in front of a paying crowd. The reindeer were the pretext, the people were the draw, and Hagenbeck watched the gate receipts and never went back to animals alone. Within a decade, these ethnographic tours, which he branded Welkerschauen, ran as a second business line alongside the menagerie trade. And by his own account, a single production cost him something like 60,000 marks to mount, cast, and stage. That is the number the box office had to clear before a single mark counted as profit, and something close to that math sat underneath every human exhibition that copied his template for the next 80 years. Hagenbeck repeated the formula immediately. In 1876, he sent a collaborator to Egyptian Sudan to bring back both wild animals and a group of Nubians, and that exhibit toured Paris, London, and Berlin to full houses. By 1884, he was touring with 67 people from Ceylon at once, a single production large enough to fill an entire circus lot. Each of these tours added one more piece of scientific varnish on top of the entertainment, and that varnish was itself a revenue tool. In 1869, the physician Rudolf Virchow had founded the Berlin Society for Anthropology, and Virchow made a habit of having his colleagues measure the bodies of performers wherever a Welkerschau came through the city, publishing the results as serious ethnological research. A show that scientists were willing to study was a show a museum or a zoological garden could host without embarrassment, and a show hosted at a respected institution could charge a respected institution's admission price. Science was not a check on the business. It was one more line on the revenue side. And it is the same reasoning that later put Ota Benga on display inside New York's own Museum of Natural History before he ever reached the zoo. Scale that template up across the whole industry, and the totals get hard to hold in your head. Historians who study this period, most prominently the French researcher Pascal Blanchard, put the full count at somewhere between 30 and 35,000 individual people exhibited worldwide between about 1810 and 1940, drawing something close to 1.5 billion tickets sold across a century and a half of touring shows, fairs, zoos, and circuses. 1.5 billion is not a typo. It is roughly the population of the entire planet at the time the practice finally ended. Now the cost side properly, because it has 4 parts, and none of them is the ticket booth. First, sourcing. Somebody has to go and get the people, and this was rarely a job posting. Agents worked through colonial officials, missionaries, and local intermediaries, sometimes with wages promised, often without. The explorer Samuel Werner, sent to the Congo Free State to gather performers for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904, bought 7 people from the Batwa outright and located an 8th, Mbuti man, for sale in a market run by a rival group. The asking price for that 8th man, Ota Benga, came to a pound of salt and a bolt of cloth. That was not a scandal at the time. It was procurement. In Hamburg, Hagenbeck ran the same function through his own half-brother, who spent years in Ceylon sourcing performers for the family firm exactly the way a trading house sources coffee or timber, as raw material with a going rate attached. Second, transport and containment. A ship's passage across an ocean, food for the crossing, and, in nearly every surviving account, guards to prevent the group from walking off before the tour paid out. Disease did more damage on these voyages than any storm ever did to a cargo hull. In August of 1880, Hagenbeck's agent Johann Adrian Jacobsen sailed to Labrador and recruited 8 Inuit, 2 families, to tour Germany and France. German law required the group to be vaccinated against smallpox before the tour began. Jacobsen skipped it, whether from haste or from simple cost-cutting. Nobody now can say for certain. By January of 1881, all 8 were dead of smallpox in a Paris hospital, the last survivor dying 3 days after the man who had kept a diary of the whole ordeal, a young father named Abraham Ulrikov. Skipping one legally required vaccination step killed an entire cast in under 5 months. A dead performer was a total loss with no insurance behind it, precisely like a cargo lost in a wreck, except this cargo had a name, a wife, and 2 young daughters. Third, staging. Every exhibit needed a constructed village, and the construction was deliberately cheap. Bamboo fencing, a handful of thatched huts, borrowed livestock, and a painted backdrop meant to suggest a jungle or a desert regardless of where the performers actually came from. The materials were disposable on purpose, because the whole set had to be struck, crated, and rebuilt at the next city on the circuit. A set that survived 1 season intact was found money. A set that had to be rebuilt from nothing was simply next season's cost of doing business, no different in kind from replacing a sale. Fourth, wages, and this is where the ledger gets its ugliest line item. Contracts existed on paper, money was sometimes paid, but the manager almost always controlled both the box office and the payroll at once, and the gap between those 2 numbers is where a second, quieter fortune got made. Truman Hunt, an American physician who managed a touring Igorot exhibition out of the Philippines after the 1904 fair, took his performers from St. Louis to Coney Island to Chicago on a circuit that ran 2 more years after the exposition itself had closed. Federal investigators eventually charged him with embezzling roughly $9,600 in wages he owed the people in his care, on top of physically forcing them to hand over money they had earned separately selling their own handmade souvenirs. 2 men in his group died on the road during that tour. Hunt did not report the deaths. He kept touring. Pinkerton agents finally caught up with him in Memphis, Tennessee, and he served time for it. That $9,600 is the one number from this entire industry a court forced a manager to admit to under oath, and it tells you plainly that the wage line on this ledger was routinely padded in the operator's favor, not the performer's. Quick pause here while the numbers add up. Drop where you're watching from in the comments below. I read every one. Now the revenue side, and this is where a marginal-looking business starts to look enormous. The Paris Exposition of 1889 built what organizers called a Negro village on the Champ de Mars. 400 people from France's colonies housed there for the run of the fair. Historians estimate its own foot traffic at as many as 28 million visitors, out of just over 32 million who passed through the exposition's gates in total, making it, by attendance, the single biggest draw at the fair alongside the newly completed Eiffel Tower standing right next to it. 400 people. 28 million tickets sold to see them across less than 6 months of operation. Whatever the daily cost of housing and feeding 400 people came to, it stopped mattering somewhere in the first few weeks. Everything after that was close to pure margin. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904 ran the same arithmetic at a larger scale. The Philippine reservation alone covered 47 acres and held more than 1,000 Filipinos from over 30 distinct ethnic groups, financed with well over $1 million in appropriated federal funds, inside a fair that drew nearly 20 million visitors over its season. Within that reservation, a 6-acre section called the Igorot Village, home to roughly 100 people, became the single most visited site on the entire grounds, and the reason was a stage dog feast performed for the crowd every day. Igorot families in their own communities ate dog only on rare ceremonial occasions. At the fair, organizers arranged a standing weekly order of 20 dogs from the city pound, specifically so the ceremony could run daily instead of occasionally. Because a daily spectacle sells daily tickets and an occasional custom does not. The custom itself was not the product being sold. A dependable, repeatable performance of the custom was the product, manufactured on what was effectively a supply contract with an animal shelter. A smaller but telling example ran in Paris again in 1907, at a colonial garden on the eastern edge of the city called the Jardin d'Agronomie Tropicale. Villages representing Tunisia, Morocco, Congo, and Madagascar were built there for a single season, and the site pulled in roughly 2 million paying visitors between May and October, buying food and souvenirs on top of the entrance fee the whole time. 2 million visitors for one modest temporary garden on the edge of the city gives you a sense of just how reliable this particular kind of attraction had become by the early 1900s. It was not a novelty by then. It was a proven category with a predictable rate of return, the sort of thing a fair board could budget around with confidence. Layer the ancillary revenue on top of the gate, and the picture gets fuller still. Souvenir booklets, sold at nearly every exhibit, described the people inside almost entirely in invented or exaggerated terms and cost pennies to print against a much higher cover price. Postcards, run off by the thousand from posed photographs, traveled home in visitors' coat pockets and kept the exhibit earning long after any individual visitor had left the fairground. Newspapers paid for exclusive access and ran the resulting stories for weeks, advertising the show for free in a way no operator could ever have bought outright. And when a given fair ended, the underlying asset did not retire. Hunt's Igorot Company kept earning for 2 more years after St. Louis closed its gates. Hagenbeck's productions rotated from city to city across Germany, France, and Britain for decades on end. In the flat language of the business itself, the people involved were treated as a durable good. Once acquired and transported, they could be redeployed indefinitely, and every additional stop on a tour was close to pure profit stacked against a cost that had already been paid off long before. Set the two sides of this ledger next to each other, and the shape of the whole enterprise becomes obvious. A fixed, front-loaded cost to source, transport, and stage a group of people. A near limitless, recurring revenue stream from ticket sales, postcards, and press coverage that kept paying out for as long as a tour continued and the novelty held. 60,000 marks looks like a serious number in isolation, right up until you set it against Hamburg's own attendance figures, or against 28 million tickets sold in Paris, or against a fair that drew close to 20 million people to St. Louis alone. The break-even point on a human exhibition, once the set was built and the people were under contract, usually arrived within the first few days of a run that could last for months. Everything after that first week was the actual business, and the actual business was extraordinarily good. None of this holds together without a cost the ledger never wrote down, because the people being priced were not commodities, whatever the paperwork implied. Ota Benga was moved from the St. Louis Fair to the American Museum of Natural History and finally to the Bronx Zoo's Monkey House over the course of 2 years, displayed without pay, mocked by crowds who poked and chased him, and injured at one point defending himself with a bow he had made from scratch. A group of black ministers in New York eventually forced the exhibit closed through sustained public pressure. He never settled into a stable life afterward, and in 1916, in Lynchburg, Virginia, he took his own life. In Tervuren, Belgium, in the summer of 1897, King Leopold II brought 267 Congolese people to his own estate for a colonial exhibition that drew over 1 million visitors. 7 of them died that summer of cold and disease, and their remains went into an unmarked grave that was not located again for more than a century. Neither Ota Benga's death nor those 7 graves ever appear on any surviving balance sheet, because a balance sheet only records what someone chose to write down, and no operator in this industry had a reason to write those particular entries in. The industry did not end because anyone's conscience caught up with its arithmetic. It ended because the arithmetic broke. The First World War severed the supply chain at its root, as agents stationed abroad lost contact with organizers back home, and Germany, the trade's biggest single operator, lost its overseas colonies outright at the peace table that followed. What had run for 40 years as a serious, professionalized business spent the interwar decades shrinking into circus sideshows and smaller regional fairs. An industry quietly running out of both the raw material and the audience appetite that had built it in the first place. It did not disappear completely until 1958 in Brussels, at a World's Fair explicitly built to celebrate post-war science and progress. Belgium constructed a Congolese village on the fairground and brought 598 people from the Congo to inhabit it behind a fence, for a fair that would go on to draw more than 41 million visitors across its 6-month run. Spectators threw coins and bananas over that fence the way you might at an animal enclosure, and by several accounts, some of the Congolese performers threw the coins back, protested their treatment openly, and demanded to be sent home. Historians of the period generally agree it was the last major production this industry ever staged anywhere in the world. Congo won its independence from Belgium 2 years later, in 1960. So here is what the finished ledger actually shows, once every column gets filled in honestly. A fixed cost to acquire, transport, and stage a group of human beings, dressed up in the paperwork as recruitment, transport, and set construction. A recurring, nearly unlimited revenue stream from watching them, dressed up as education, science, and entertainment. And a gap between those two figures that operators called profit for 80 straight years, right up until an audience finally stopped paying for it. You were never really selling a village, or a custom, or a culture, however the souvenir booklet phrased it. You were selling a paying crowd its own reflection, dressed up as somebody else's ordinary life, at a nightly rate that beat almost anything else on the fairground. Compare that to everything else this channel has priced out. A ship owner risked his own capital on a season's weather and came home with a margin measured in tens of units. A drug importer risked prison and a rival's knife for a margin measured in multiples. The men who ran human zoos risked almost nothing at all. Their raw material was supplied by colonial administrations that wanted the propaganda as much as the operators wanted the gate receipts. Their venues were often built and subsidized by the same governments, and their audience turned out in the tens of millions without any advertising budget beyond a poster and a newspaper willing to run the story for free. It was, by the flat measure of cost against return, one of the most efficient entertainment businesses of its century. That efficiency is exactly the problem. It was efficient because the single most expensive input in almost any other business, the well-being of the people involved, had been priced at essentially nothing. Ships rot. Ledgers burn. This industry's ledger did not, because the men running it never once felt they had anything to hide. Reading their own numbers back to them all these years later is the only part of the transaction anyone still owes.